The Phantom Footsteps. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The old house had always been quiet. Its walls bore the scars of a century's worth of seasons, the paint peeling like brittle parchment, and the wood floors groaning under the weight of memory. For Clara, inheriting the place was a bittersweet affair. She had spent childhood summers there with her grandmother, whose passing left the house in her hands. Nostalgia softened her trepidation as she unlocked the creaking door. The air inside was heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath since her last visit. Clara moved through the rooms with care, her footsteps soft against the warped floorboards. Dust motes swirled in the pale afternoon light streaming through fractured windows. Each room was a tableau of faded memories, the floral wallpaper her grandmother had loved, the sagging armchair by the fire, the kitchen with its faint smell of lavender and age. It began that first night. She had just extinguished her bedside lamp, the darkness pressing in like a dense fog. As she lay there, listening to the symphony of nighttime insects, a sound cut through the stillness, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing down the upstairs hallway. Her breath hitched, and she froze. It had been years since anyone else had walked those floors. She listened, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder, each step dragging faintly as if whoever or whatever was walking had an uneven gait. Gathering her courage, Clara crept out of bed. She grabbed her phone for light, its faint beam trembling in her hand as she opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, a dark tunnel that seemed to breathe. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking. Silence answered. She edged forward, peering into each room. They were empty, their shadows playing tricks on her mind. Telling herself it was an old house making old house sounds, she returned to bed, though sleep was a distant stranger. The following days were no better. The footsteps came nightly, sometimes faint and hesitant, other times bold and purposeful. Clara noticed small, unsettling details around the house. Items she hadn't touched would be moved, a chair slightly askew, a door left ajar. Once, she found a child's dusty handprint smeared across the mirror in the upstairs bathroom. She tried to rationalize it all, even calling a carpenter to inspect the creaking floorboards. The man spent hours poking and prodding but found nothing unusual. "Old houses make noise," he said with a shrug. "But this one feels different, doesn't it?" That night, Clara stayed up late, determined to catch the source of the disturbances. She sat in the living room, a fire crackling weakly in the hearth. The hours crawled by. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. Just as she began to think she'd imagined it all, the footsteps began. This time, they were heavier, more insistent. They descended the staircase, one step at a time, each creak a nail driven into Clara's resolve. She stood, clutching the iron poker from the fireplace, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Who's there?" she shouted. The footsteps paused, then resumed, faster now, charging toward her. Clara stumbled back, her trembling hands raising the poker. The air grew icy, her breath visible in the firelight. As the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound stopped abruptly. Clara squinted into the gloom, her eyes darting between shadows. A low, guttural whisper broke the silence, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. She bolted for the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock as the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and surging toward her. The door finally gave way, and she stumbled into the night, collapsing on the overgrown lawn. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Clara never went back. She sold the house to a faceless company that cared only for the land. Years later, she heard it had been demolished, replaced by a parking lot. But sometimes, late at night, Clara would swear she could still hear the sound of footsteps, faint and distant, echoing through her dreams. Clara tried to leave the experience behind her, burying it deep within the recesses of her mind. She moved to a bustling city, surrounding herself with noise and people, hoping to drown out the memory of those dreadful nights. Her new apartment was modern, its clean lines and bright lights a deliberate contrast to the oppressive shadows of her grandmother's house. At first, it worked. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy. She threw herself into her work, met new friends, and even began to laugh again. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, as Clara prepared for bed, she noticed something strange. Her bedside lamp flickered, the light stuttering as though struggling against some unseen force. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off as a common electrical fault. That night, the footsteps returned. They were faint at first, just a soft tapping against the hardwood floor of her living room. Half asleep, Clara thought it might be her upstairs neighbor. But as the sound grew louder, she realized it was unmistakably within her own apartment. Her blood ran cold. She sat upright, clutching her blanket to her chest, her ears straining to track the sound. The footsteps wandered aimlessly, moving from room to room. They paused outside her bedroom door. "Not again," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The doorknob rattled. Clara stared, paralyzed, as it slowly turned. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The door creaked open a crack, and the room grew deathly silent. The air turned frigid. The lamp on her nightstand flickered violently before extinguishing altogether, plunging her into darkness. In the faint glow of the city lights filtering through her curtains, she could just make out a shadow, a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and misshapen, its outline shifting as though it were made of smoke. 2 pinpricks of light where its eyes should be burned into her, filled with malice and sorrow in equal measure. "Leave me alone!" Clara finally screamed, her voice raw with terror. The shadow did not move, but a whisper filled the room, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. This time, she could make out fragments of words. "You, remember, us." Memories she had long suppressed bubbled to the surface, her grandmother's stories about the house, tales of tragedies that had unfolded there. A family had once lived in the home, their lives ended in a fire. A child's laughter cut short. A mother's wail swallowed by smoke. The whispers grew louder, the words blending into an anguished roar. Clara covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't do anything," she cried. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The room fell silent again, the shadow still looming. It raised a hand, pointing at her with a long, spindly finger. Clara felt a weight in her chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. She clawed at her throat, gasping for air. Just as she thought she would lose consciousness, the figure dissolved into nothingness, leaving her alone in the darkness. In the days that followed, Clara's life became a waking nightmare. The footsteps haunted her wherever she went. At work, in the grocery store, even in broad daylight on the crowded streets of the city, always just behind her, faint but persistent. Desperate, she sought out help. She visited psychics, priests, and paranormal investigators, hoping for answers or salvation. None could help her. Some claimed she had been marked by the spirits of the house, cursed to carry their presence with her. One psychic, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, gave her a chilling warning. "They are not done with you," she said. "You carry their pain. Until you face it, they will never let you go." Clara decided to return to the site of the old house. It was now a soulless parking lot, its asphalt cracked and lined with weeds. She stood there at dusk, clutching a photograph of her grandmother, and spoke into the empty air. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For whatever happened. For disturbing your peace. Please, let me go." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wind picked up, swirling around her in a fierce vortex. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a tumult of anger, sorrow, and longing. Clara fell to her knees, sobbing, as the voices reached a deafening crescendo. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air was still. The oppressive weight lifted from her chest. For the first time in months, Clara felt a strange, unfamiliar calm. She left the parking lot and never looked back. The footsteps never returned, but the memory of those nights lingered like a shadow in her mind, a scar she would carry forever. Months passed, and life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. Clara moved to a smaller town, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The little cottage she found was cozy and unassuming, with bright windows and a garden teeming with life. It felt like a fresh start. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that the horrors were truly behind her. She even began to sleep through the night again. But hope has a way of playing cruel tricks, and the peace she found proved to be fragile. It started subtly. On particularly quiet nights, Clara would hear the faintest echo of footsteps outside her window. Always faint, always distant, as though someone or something was circling her home. She convinced herself it was the wind, the shifting branches of nearby trees, or the nocturnal creatures that inhabited the woods surrounding the cottage. One evening, as she prepared dinner, Clara noticed something odd. A picture frame on the mantel, one she hadn't touched, was lying face down. She frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The glass was intact, and the photograph inside was undamaged, but when she glanced at it, a chill ran through her. It was a photo of her grandmother sitting on the porch of the old house. Behind her, in the reflection of a window, Clara could now see a shadowy figure. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tall, smoke-like outline, with faint pinpricks of light where its eyes should be. Her hand shook as she set the frame back in place. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, her mind playing games with her. But the unease settled in her chest like a stone. That night, the footsteps returned, louder than ever before. They didn't stay outside this time. They moved through the cottage, each step deliberate and resonant, as if whoever was walking wanted her to know they were there. Clara didn't bother turning on the lights or grabbing a weapon. She knew what she was dealing with. She sat in the middle of her living room, trembling but resolute. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The footsteps stopped. The room grew unnaturally cold, her breath visible in the air. The whispers began again, low and guttural, swelling into an unintelligible chorus. This time, however, one voice emerged from the chaos. "Remember," it hissed. Images flooded her mind, fragments of memories that weren't her own. A little boy playing with a wooden toy train, his laughter echoing through the halls of her grandmother's house. A woman sewing by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Then came the fire, the acrid smell of smoke, the roar of flames, and the screams. Clara gasped, clutching her head as the memories overwhelmed her. She saw herself, or rather, someone who looked like her, standing at the edge of the fire. The woman had her face but wore a look of cold indifference as the house burned. "It wasn't me," Clara cried, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't do this." The whispers swelled again, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her. The voice spoke once more, louder this time. "You, bare her face." Clara realized with a sickening jolt what the entity meant. Her grandmother. The resemblance between them had always been striking, and the spirits had mistaken her for the one who had wronged them. "I'm not her," Clara pleaded. "She's gone. She's been gone for years." The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting slightly. But the shadow figure materialized before her, its form more solid than ever. It loomed over her, its eyeless gaze burning into her soul. "You must make it right," it said, its voice a terrible blend of fury and despair. "What do you want me to do?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure pointed toward the fireplace. In the ashes, something glinted faintly. With shaking hands, Clara approached and reached inside. She pulled out a small, charred box. Opening it, she found an old, soot-covered locket. Inside was a photograph of the family she'd seen in her visions. She understood then. They wanted to be remembered, to have their story known. The next day, Clara drove back to the town where the old house had stood. She found a local historical society and donated the locket, along with everything she could recall of the visions and the whispers. She told the story of the family, ensuring their memory would not fade into obscurity. That night, for the first time in years, Clara slept peacefully. The footsteps never returned. Yet sometimes, as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard a faint voice, soft and almost grateful, whispering, "Thank you."